Welcome everybody to our ninth My Story at Southampton. Before I introduce this week's speaker, I think it would be wrong of me not to mention the passing of Peter Korichner last Friday. It was only 3 Sundays ago that we listened to the wonderful and emotional interview by Rabbi Shlomo with Peter, which gave us an insight into his extraordinary life, who he was and why the community loved him. It was a great privilege to hear his special story and to see how this community cared and nursed for him and gave him dignity through the last period of his life. Now, on to this week's My Story. Perhaps one of the most important events in modern Jewish history, the Warsaw Ghetto uprising of 1943. Our speaker is one of the nicest, brightest, and humble people that I know, Hyman Wolanski.
Thank you, Lawrence. Great, I'll give you the fiver later. So good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining me. Just to follow on what you just said, Lawrence, I'd like to dedicate this talk to Peter, because I'm sure that he would have really wanted to listen to this. I have no doubt of that. So welcome, everybody. I've been fascinated by the story of the Warsaw Ghetto since my teenage days, when one of the first grown-up books that I read was Mila 18 by Leon Uris. This was a marvelous fictional account of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. In case you don't know, Mila 18 was an address in Warsaw, and we'll go there a bit later. So much for the book, but what about the film, I hear you ask? Well, I would hear you ask if you weren't all muted. Well, there's been no film of the book so far. One was going to be made a few years ago, but that project ground to a halt when Harvey Weinstein, who was going to make it, ended up in jail. He was thinking of calling the film Jews with Guns, so maybe it's better that he didn't go ahead with it after all. I also have a personal interest in the Warsaw Ghetto, since my mother lived there from its beginning right up to a few days before it was liquidated. Her name was Chava, but she was called Eva, and she was just 20 when the war broke out, and she'd be very angry with me for telling you about her age. I'll tell you more about her and her family using some of the information that she recorded in her diary. The basic story of the Warsaw Ghetto is very well known, so I'll try to focus on how this affected the lives of the Jews in Warsaw and what was actually going on below the surface. You should be aware that in addition to the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, which was carried out by the Jews in April-May 43, there was another uprising called the Warsaw Uprising that was carried out by the Warsaw Poles in August 1944, and that's nothing to do with the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. So whenever I refer to the uprising, I'm talking about the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, the Jewish one. Also, I need to warn you that this journey is going to cover an awful lot of ground, and some bits of it are going to be very tough. So apologies in advance for this. So fasten your seatbelts and let's start our journey to pre-war Warsaw. In 1939, just before the war started, the total population of Poland was around 35 million, of whom about 10%, 3.5 million, were Jews. Poland at that time had more Jews than any other country in the world apart from the United States, which had 4.7 million Jews. Those two countries together, Poland and the USA, had 8.2 million Jews, which was half of the world's population of 16.5 million Jews at that time. Coming back to Warsaw, had a population of about 1.3 million people in total, and it was the 7th largest city in Europe. Now, about 30% of its population, 30%, that's 375,000, were Jews, making it Europe's largest Jewish community and second only to New York. At that time, my mother was living with her family in her hometown, a rather pretty little town called Nowy Dwór, about 25 miles northwest of Warsaw. It had a population of around 10,000, of whom 40% were Jews. Her parents were Chaim and Rachel. She was one of 4 children and had 2 younger sisters, Toby and Esther, and an older brother, Shimon, who she adored. And as was typical in those days, she had a large extended family, including grandparents and a host of aunts, uncles, cousins, all of whom lived on top of each other, and everybody knew what everyone else was doing at every time of the day. It was a close and loving family, and their home resonated with the sounds of laughter, singing, and political discussions that inevitably turned to heated arguments. That's until the lemon tea and my grandmother's cakes came out. You get the picture. My grandfather Chaim, who I was named after, was a lively and smart man. He was well respected, and unlike many of the community, he spoke Polish and Russian as well as Yiddish. He ran a tailoring workshop, so the family, relatively speaking, was well off. He had a fine singing voice, unlike me, and performed in amateur concerts and plays. According to my mother, his performance as King Lear, in Yiddish of course, was the talk of the town for ages, or the talk of the Jewish part of the town for ages, I would think. My grandmother Rachel, by contrast, was a very gentle and quiet woman who was devoted to looking after the family. Aromas of Hamisher cooking wafted from her kitchen, and of course she baked her own challahs every Friday and for every Yom Tov. Since my mother Eva was the eldest daughter, she was given a lot of responsibility. She was an energetic and happy girl and a devoted daughter. She helped her father in his business and her mother in the kitchen and around the home. She was ambitious, hardworking and resourceful, and just got on with things. These were all attributes that would help her to survive the challenges ahead that she could never in her wildest dreams imagine that she would have to face. She loved her siblings. Shimon, her brother, was the oldest of them all. He was a gentle and refined young man who'd been educated at college in Warsaw. He was good looking with blonde hair and blue eyes, not very Jewish looking. And like me, he was a keen photographer. Esther was a little younger than my mother, a bright, high-spirited girl with lots of guts and an iron will. She was an ardent Zionist and her ginger hair was perfectly matched to her fiery temperament. And Toby was the youngest of the family, a tall, beautiful girl with stunning green eyes. She was very intelligent, refined, and unlike Esther, quietly spoken. We'll come back to the family shortly. Now, the 1930s in Warsaw was a schizophrenic period for the Jews of Warsaw. On the one hand, it was a golden age of Yiddish and Jewish culture. At that time, Warsaw was the most important Jewish cultural center in the world. There were 2 daily Yiddish newspapers, book publishing, theater, cabaret, music, art, sculpture, and scholarship. There was even a chair in Jewish history at Warsaw University. It really was a dynamic place from a Jewish perspective. The theater included Yiddish translations of classics, including Shakespeare, as I've mentioned before, and these were usually described by the translators as übergesetzt und verbessert, which means translated and improved. I'm not sure what the Bard would have made of that, but I can assure you that if you've never seen The Merchant of Venice in Yiddish, you just haven't lived. But on the other hand, while all this was going on, anti-Semitism was on the increase, particularly after the death of Marshal Pilsudski, the de facto leader in Poland in May 1935. This included economic boycotts and physical attacks on Polish Jews and was part of an undisguised attempt by the Polish government to encourage Jews to emigrate. They made no secret of the fact that they just didn't want so many Jews in their country. For example, in January 1937, the foreign minister, Joseph Beck, declared that Poland could house only 500,000 Jews as opposed to the 3.5 million that it had. And he hoped that over the next 30 years, 80 to 100,000 Jews a year would leave the country. For this reason, the Polish government was a strong supporter of a Jewish state in Palestine. They saw that as a much better place for their Jews than Poland. In fact, most of the Polish Jews would have been more than happy to oblige and leave, but it wasn't so easy. The Zionists couldn't go to Palestine because of Britain's restrictions on the number of Jews that they would let in, and following Hitler's rise to power in Germany, many other countries weren't keen to admit Jews either. So you had a golden age of Yiddishkeit coexisting with increasing anti-Semitism. The Jewish community was very politically engaged, particularly the younger members who couldn't see a positive future ahead. There were lots of Jewish groups covering the whole spectrum of political views, and they spent most of their time arguing and disagreeing with each other, so nothing new there. The youngsters all belonged to one of the many youth groups that provided both social activity and ideological indoctrination. There were so many different political groups that it's very difficult to summarize the position. It's probably easiest to look at a 3-way split between the Zionists, the Socialists, and the Orthodox, but it was actually much more complex and nuanced than that. Let's just have a look at, if you can see this slide, which I can't see on mine, don't worry too much about it. This is just a representation of only the Zionist parties at that time. A complete mishmash and a mess. They all group and splinter and go left and go right, all very complicated. So let's stop that and let's look at the Zionists. There were lots of different Zionist parties, and whilst they all supported the concept of Jews living in Palestine, they had very different ideas of how to achieve a Jewish state and what to do with it. There were several socialist Zionist movements. They all wanted to create a socialist Jewish paradise in Palestine where the Jews would no longer suffer as a minority. At the opposite end of the political spectrum were the revisionist Zionists. They followed Jabotinsky's revision of the practical Zionism of Ben-Gurion and Weizmann, and they wanted the Jews to occupy the whole of Eretz Israel, i.e. both sides of the River Jordan. They preached a militant Zionism and provided paramilitary training for their members. Their youth group, Beitar, was the largest Zionist youth movement in Poland. The young Menachem Begin was one of their leaders, but he left Warsaw when the war started, so he doesn't feature in the story. And in the center, in between the socialist and the revisionist Zionists, were the general Zionists. So that's the Zionists. Now, one of the largest non-Zionist groups was the Bund, which was a socialist party and very anti-Zionist. Their answer to the Jewish problem was not to run off to Palestine and create a Jewish state, but to remain in Poland and, together with the Polish socialists, create a socialist Poland where Jews could keep their Jewish identity but still have equal status with the non-Jews. Unlike the Zionist groups, which promoted Hebrew, the Bund concentrated on secular Yiddish culture. And within the religious community, there were also deep divisions. Mizrahi was an Orthodox Zionist movement whose slogan was "the land of Israel for the people of Israel according to the Torah of Israel." That's a great slogan and tells you all you need to know about them. The ultra-Orthodox had joined together to form Agudas Yisrael. Whilst the land of Israel was at the heart of their religion, they rejected Herzl's political Zionism because they believed that a true Jewish state would emerge only from divine intervention, i.e. from the Mashiach. And Herzl was certainly not the Mashiach as far as they were concerned. And for good measure, a small minority of the Polish Jews were out and out communists. Now, these splits were serious. For example, in the 1936 elections for the Warsaw Jewish Community Council, the Zionists couldn't agree to enter into a coalition with the staunchly anti-Zionist Agudas Yisrael. Where have you heard that sort of story before? This made it impossible to set up a functioning council, so the Polish government dissolved the council and in its place appointed a group of Jews unaffiliated with any of the parties. Now, this meant that the Jewish community had no elected leadership in the run-up to World War II. So let's get on to the war. As you know, World War II started on 1st September 1939, when the Germans invaded Poland. Exactly 1 month later, on 1st October 1939, the Wehrmacht entered Warsaw and started an occupation that lasted until January 1945. When the war started, my mother's family decided to move from their town Nowy Dwór to Warsaw, thinking that would be safer there for the meantime. Only one of the family didn't join them, my mother's brother Szymon. They thought that Warsaw would be particularly dangerous for a young man. So with a few friends, he escaped to the east, near the border with Russia. My mother never saw him again. After the Germans occupied Warsaw, there was a lull in the fighting, so the family decided that it would be safe to return home to Nowy Dwór. However, Nowy Dwór suffered badly from the German attacks because it was close to a Polish military base. And when the family got back there, they were shocked to find that many of the town's buildings had been bombed, and in particular that their family home was in ruins. They were now homeless. So they decided to go back to Warsaw. But my mother's sister Esther, the strong-willed one, absolutely refused to go with them because she wanted to be near her boyfriend. So my mother went back to Warsaw with just her parents and her sister Toby. So we're now back in Warsaw. The occupation has started. The Nazis' aim at that stage was to impoverish and plunder the Jews and exploit their labor. Mass murder was to come later. Now, one of the first things that the Germans did was to disband the Kahila, which was the elected communal structure, and replace it with the Judenrat, the Jewish council. And I'll come back to this in more detail shortly. Now, the German occupation of Warsaw was a dreadful time for all its inhabitants, but of course the Jews got special treatment and humiliation. I won't go through the full list, but it includes they had to register and the word Judo was stamped on their identity cards. They had to identify themselves on the streets by wearing white armbands with a blue Star of David on their right arm and had to lift their hats to passing Germans. They were placed outside the law. They were forbidden from walking on pavements. You've heard this stuff before. It was all pretty bad, but it was to get a whole lot worse. So moving on to April 1940, 6 months into the occupation, The Germans ordered construction to start on building a wall around the area of Warsaw that was inhabited predominantly by Jews, although Jews lived all over Warsaw. This was the beginning of what would be the largest ghetto in Nazi-occupied Europe. And guess who built the wall? Jewish forced laborers. On 12th of October 1940, which was Yom Kippur, the Germans had a habit of doing things to the Jews on Jewish holidays. They established the Warsaw Ghetto. Now let's have a quick look at that. All the Jews in Warsaw had to relocate to the ghetto area by 16th November 40, when the ghetto was sealed by a wall, and you can see the strong black line there. The wall was 10 feet high and topped with barbed wire and broken glass, and was closely guarded to stop the Jews leaving. Tens of thousands of non-Jews had to move out of the area designated for the ghetto, and even more Jews from other parts of Warsaw moved in. Since my mother and her family were in Warsaw, they too had to move into the ghetto. Now, the ghetto was around 1.3 square miles in area. Now, if like me, you struggle to know what this means in practice, then think of a square where each side is just a little bit over a mile long. That's it. Now, this was just 2.4% of the city area, whereas the Jews, as I said, constituted around 30% of the population. So the population density in the ghetto was very high. Although many people died from the terrible living conditions, the ghetto population grew to around 460,000 as a maximum, as Jews from towns around Warsaw were transferred into the ghetto. And it wasn't just Jews, there were a couple of thousand Roma were moved in at one stage. That really went down well. The population was to fall dramatically from July 1942, following the start of mass deportations to Treblinka, and it was zero by the time the ghetto was liquidated on the 16th of May 43. Anyone who was caught trying to escape from the ghetto was shot on sight, and the death penalty also applied to any Poles who were caught helping Jews in any way. Despite that, there were recorded lots of instances when Poles on the Aryan side of the ghetto did help Jews who had managed to escape. But this is a very big subject, and unfortunately, I don't have time to go into it today. So in the ghetto, living conditions were dreadful. As well as being very cramped, there were often up to 10 people in a room. Everything was in short supply, particularly food and medicine. There were awful sanitary conditions. Many homes didn't have access to running water, and soap was in short supply. So there were many deaths from lack of medical care, typhoid, and other infections, and starvation. Food was in such short supply that there was lots of food smuggling coming in from the Aryan side. The smugglers included children as young as 5 and 6, who smuggled into the ghetto food that often weighed more than they did. Maybe some of you have seen those newsreel shots of a little kid being shaken and food just falling off him everywhere. The Germans had no compunction about shooting these kids when they were caught, but that didn't stop the smuggling because of the desperate shortage of food. The conditions in the ghetto were so bad that 70 to 80,000 Jews, some 20% of the population, just died of starvation, disease, and cold up to July 1942, when the mass deportation started. Those numbers would have been even higher without the smuggling of food and medicines. Now, despite the horrific conditions in the ghetto, cultural, religious, and political life continued, albeit in a clandestine manner. At the cultural level, there were concerts, plays, and cabaret performances, as well as continued education for children. There was also higher education. For example, there was a medical school in the ghetto where lectures were held from 1 a.m. to 4 a.m. every day, 7 days a week. And the medical students then had to work after that in hospital for 12 hours a day. At a political level, there was an underground press and meetings to discuss, obviously, the situation of the Jews in Poland and the war in general, but they looked forward to the new world order that they were sure would prevail once the war was over. And the religious Jews continued to take part in secret group prayers, studying the Talmud and the Torah, and other religious activities, and of course, celebrating Jewish holidays. Now, all these activities were banned, and the participants were at risk of extreme punishment if caught. I'd like to tell you now about the historian Emanuel Ringelblum. He was a remarkable man, a historian, who together with dozens of writers and scholars, secretly and obsessively created an archive of thousands of documents detailing the Nazi crimes against the Jews. This included recorded eyewitness accounts and items from daily life in the ghetto, like underground newspapers, public notices by the Nazis and the Judenrat, drawings and posters. Ringelblum used to refer to these records as the conscience of the ghetto. Now, this work was extremely risky. Those involved would certainly have been killed if discovered, which was the reason that it was done so secretly. Whilst the Germans took very little interest in what the Jews were actually doing amongst themselves in the ghetto, there was always an ongoing risk of being informed upon by other Jews in the ghetto, hence the extreme secrecy here. The group was called Oneg Shabbos because they tended to meet secretly on Shabbos to discuss their progress. There were two main purposes to their work. One was to defeat the Nazi lies and propaganda by smuggling authentic, detailed reports of their atrocities to the outside world. The group's reports were sent to the Polish underground, the Polish government in exile in London, and to the Allies, although it doesn't look as if any of that achieved anything worthwhile. The other purpose was to ensure that there would be a Jewish record of the war and of Jewish life pre-war for future generations after the war was over. They were particularly worried that if the Germans won the war, it would be the German view of the Jews that would prevail and not the Jewish view. These records were very important, being a contemporaneous record of the Nazi crimes. And as a historian, Ringelblum had to decide what to include and leave out. He tried hard to report events as objectively as possible, and he included reports that didn't show the Jews in a good light. We'll come back to that when we talk about the Judenrat and the Jewish police. He was particularly scathing about both of them. When the leaders of the group heard that the ghetto was going to be destroyed, they buried their collection in metal boxes and 3 milk churns just before the uprising to prevent the archive from falling into the Nazis' hands. After the war, a number of the metal boxes and 2 of the 3 milk churns containing some 30,000 documents were dug up and restored. You should see a picture of it there. These archives provided a massive detailed and invaluable information about the period. Despite repeated searches, the 3rd milk churn was never found, and it's believed to be buried somewhere under the Chinese embassy in Warsaw. So let's now look at the Judenrat. The Germans set up the Judenrat, Jewish Council, on 4th of October 39, just after they occupied Warsaw, and they appointed Adam Chernikov as its head, an engineer. He was ordered to provide names of 24 Jews, all men, who would become members of the Judenrat, and was told that their sole task was to carry out the orders given by the Gestapo. The role of the Judenrat and the Jewish ghetto police that we'll discuss next is extremely controversial. Although the Judenrat was a new organization, in a way it was an extension of the earlier Kahila, which had been set up by the Jews as their communal organization, the sort of board of deputies. However, the Judenrat, unlike the Kahila, was set up for the benefit of the Nazis, not the Jews. The Judenrat was responsible for the internal administration of the ghetto, but of course they had no real authority of their own. In the early days, one of their main roles was to deliver community members for forced labor, but over time, the Nazis demanded much more from them, and they were required to supply Jews for deportation to their death at Treblinka. The Judenrat was a cynical concept developed by the Nazis to get the Jews to do their dirty work for them and to keep some sort of order in the ghetto. And on top of that, it deflected much of the Jewish community's hostility away from the Germans and towards the Judenrat. The Judenrat was inevitably forced into making very difficult and conflicted decisions, which often led to them being accused of unfair actions, protecting their families and friends at the expense of the community as a whole, and collaboration with the Nazis. The fact of the matter is that the Judenrat was stuck between a rock and a hard place. They faced impossible moral dilemmas, and they argued that cooperating and negotiating with the Germans, including handing over some people for certain death, by doing this, they were buying time for and protecting those who hadn't been handed over. In other words, cooperating with the Germans was the lesser of 2 evils. On 23rd July 42, the pressure on Chernikov, the head of the Warsaw Judenrat, was so great that for reasons I'll come to shortly, he committed suicide. As a further example of the pressures on the Judenrat, let's move to Lodz, which the Poles pronounce Łódź, and look at Chaim Rumkowski, who was the head of their Judenrat. Like Chernikov, he was placed in an impossible position by the Germans, and he made a famous speech called "Give Me Your Children." You can guess what it's about from the title, and I have to say that it's the most heartrending and painful speech that I have ever heard. You can hear it on the internet, read by an actor if you want to, but I do warn you that it's very tough to listen to. Now, unlike Chernikov, Wolanski didn't commit suicide. He was sent to Auschwitz in August 1944, and he died there. But he wasn't killed by the Germans. He was murdered by Jewish Sonderkommandos who beat him to death as revenge for his role as head of the Lodz Judenrat. But before you condemn him out of hand as a collaborator, one of the survivors of that ghetto said in his defense that Wolanski gave a percentage of his people a chance to survive 2 years longer than the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto. As I said, this is a controversial area. Although the Judenrat was nominally responsible for the Jewish ghetto police, in reality, this was another example of the Nazis getting the Jews to do their dirty work for them, and they took their orders from the Germans. In October 1940, a guy called Joseph Shurinsky was appointed as the head of the Jewish ghetto police. Now, this was a bizarre appointment, even by the crazy standards of the time. His real name was Schenkman, and he was a Jew who had converted to Catholicism. However, to the Nazis, he was no Catholic, so they threw him into the ghetto with all the other Jews. And that's how a Catholic Jew, a Jewish anti-Semite, if ever there was one, became the head of the Jewish ghetto police. The Warsaw Jewish police numbered 2,000 to 3,000 and was comprised of volunteers. While some of the recruits may have joined to serve the community, most joined for self-serving reasons. Members of the Jewish police didn't have official uniforms, just an identifying armband, a police cap and high boots. They weren't allowed to carry firearms, although they did carry rubber truncheons. Belonging to the Jewish police provided immunity from being seized by the Jewish police for forced labor and offered all sorts of opportunities for obtaining extra food rations and money. For example, a number of Jewish policemen played a key role in the smuggling that was carried out in the ghetto, which was a profitable business for them. They initially provided local services and preserved order in the ghetto. However, as time went on, their role became much darker, and by summer '42, they were rounding up Jews for deportation to Treblinka. So how could the Jewish policemen, who were actively sending their fellow Jews to their death, look at themselves in the mirror? Well, excuse me, some decided that they could no longer do it and left the Jewish police. But others used the standard collaborators argument that someone had to do it and that the deportations would be even more brutal and merciless if carried out by the Germans. But many remained in the Jewish police because they bought the story that they and their families would be saved from the deportations to Treblinka if they helped to send other Jews there. But they found out that this was a lie on 21st September '42, which was the final day of the mass deportations from Warsaw, when they themselves and their families were sent to Treblinka. Unsurprisingly, the ghetto residents came to deeply resent the Jewish police because of the ruthlessness of their members. And Ringelblum expressed these views by saying that Shurinsky's activities as commander of the Jewish police in Warsaw is one of the bleakest chapters in the history of that community during the Holocaust. And he added that the cruelty of the Jewish police was at times greater than that of the Germans, the Ukrainians, and the Latvians. So, Treblinka was one of the extermination camps set up for Operation Reinhardt, the German plot to exterminate the Jews in Poland. It was located about 50 miles northeast of Warsaw at an offshoot of the main railway line from Warsaw to Białystok. It was built to murder the Jews in the Warsaw and Białystok districts, and overall, between 800 and 900,000 Jews were killed at Treblinka. This means that more Jews died there than at any other Nazi extermination camp apart from Auschwitz. There was a fake railway station at Treblinka that was disguised as a transit camp for deportations further east. It had a fake station clock with hands that never moved painted on it and a fake ticket office window. There were also names of destinations and made-up train schedules. On 22nd July 1942, Gestapo officials instructed Chernikov to, quote, prepare for resettlement of non-productive elements, starting that day, which was Erev Tisha B'Av. They announced that the deportations would be limited to only 60,000 people, with most of the ghetto population being exempt. The references to only 60,000 people and exemptions were lies, and they were intended to give some hope, albeit false, to most of the population. This was the beginning of the mass deportation of Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto to Treblinka, known as the Great Deportation. Those selected for deportation were to report to the Umschlagplatz, which was an assembly point at the northern end of the ghetto by the railway sidings. The quota was 6,000 people a day who were to be supplied by the Judenrat and the Jewish police for deportation to Treblinka, which is what resettlement really meant. At the Umschlagplatz, the Germans, helped by the Jewish police, brutally forced the deportees into overcrowded freight cars on trains destined for Treblinka. The rail traffic on the Polish railway lines was extremely dense, so the trains from Warsaw to Treblinka were routinely delayed, and it sometimes took days to complete the short journey. The new arrivals at Treblinka were gassed very shortly after arrival. I won't go into the details. On the first 2 days, the Jewish police rounded up the required quota of 6,000 Jews per day from old age homes, the ghetto prison, and recent arrivals. And on the next day, 23rd July, Chernikovs was ordered to deliver 10,000 people, including children, for deportation. He couldn't do it and instead committed suicide. In his suicide note to his wife, he said, "They demand me to kill children of my nation with my own hands. I have nothing to do but to die." Initially, many ghetto Jews turned up willingly for deportation, believing that they were being sent to labor camps in the east where they could escape the misery of Warsaw. Also, they were told that they would get extra bread and jam if they reported for deportation. At that stage, they either didn't know, or if they knew, they just didn't believe that resettlement was a Nazi euphemism for going directly from Warsaw into one of the gas chambers at Treblinka. The Jewish police supervised roundups of those people who didn't turn up willingly for the deportations. They systematically cordoned off houses or entire blocks and then forced all the residents out onto the street. The Germans would then carry out a selection while Polish or Ukrainian policemen would search the abandoned homes for Jews in hiding. Many Jews who hid in the buildings or tried to escape the selections on the street were shot on the spot. Those chosen for deportation were then marched to the Umschlagplatz. On 5th of August 1942, residents of the ghetto, including my mother, saw a heartbreaking sight. Janusz Korczak was a well-known Polish Jewish doctor, educator, and head of an orphanage for Jewish children in Warsaw. On that day, he was at the front of a long line leading the children from his orphanage, all 200 of them, in the direction of the Umschlagplatz. This meant that all the children were on their way to Treblinka. The Nazis had come to the orphanage to collect the children, but despite being offered a chance to escape deportation, Korczak insisted that he would accompany them on their final journey. He died with all the children when they got to Treblinka. At that time, my mother and her father had managed to obtain work permits. They probably bought them on the black market. These were considered to be a lifeline, since it was thought, wrongly as it turned out, that workers would be exempt from resettlement. My mother and her father worked for a company in the ghetto called Tobins and Schultz, owned by 2 German war profiteers, making German army uniforms. I say worked, but this was slave labor and there was no pay. My mother and her family lived in the factory where they worked, and you can imagine how awful the conditions were. One day, the Germans came to the factory to round up the people there for deportation. My mother was away queuing for food rations and potatoes, so she missed the roundup. But when she got back to the factory, she found that her parents and sister Toby had been taken away for deportation to Treblinka. She was in shock and devastated and riddled with guilt for not having been with them when they were taken away. But she also felt that she owed it to her parents to stay alive. So this triggered an intense desire to survive at any cost, and she went into hiding to avoid further roundups. The mass deportations continued on a daily basis for 2 months until 21st September 42, which was Yom Kippur. Over that period, 250 to 300,000 of the ghetto's Jews had been deported to Treblinka and murdered there. The number of Jews remaining in the ghetto had reduced dramatically. Accurate numbers are impossible to determine since many of the remaining Jews were in hiding, but estimates indicate that the population had fallen dramatically from the 375,000 who had made Warsaw Europe's largest Jewish community 3 years earlier to around 50 to 60,000. Now, before we come to the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, we need to understand how the Jewish resistance movement developed. From around November 1941, messengers from outside Warsaw started coming to the ghetto to report on mass killings of Jews, first in Vilna and then other places. The messengers were desperately trying to make the Jews in Warsaw aware of the dangers ahead so that they could start planning their resistance against the Germans. However, most of the people in Warsaw who heard those reports, particularly the older generation, just couldn't believe them and thought that they'd been exaggerated. And many of those who did believe them thought that the Warsaw Jewish community was simply too big and important for it to be at risk. There were simply too many of them to be murdered, or so they thought. And on top of that, Governor General Frank, who was the German in charge of Warsaw, had personally assured Chernikov that the Warsaw Ghetto would remain. So there really was no need for concern in Warsaw. Well, that's what they thought. The messengers, who had often traveled from afar at great risk to themselves, were distraught and just couldn't believe the complacency and lack of urgency that they encountered. However, the Zionist youth groups took these reports seriously. They had no illusions about the Germans' true intentions of wiping out the Jews, and this led them to shift their focus from educational and cultural activities to self-defense. In March 42, these youth groups proposed the creation of a Jewish self-defense organization in the ghetto, but this was rejected for a number of reasons. First, the Bund wouldn't agree to any unilateral action because they were committed to acting jointly with the Polish socialists against the Germans. Unfortunately, as they found out later, the Bund's commitment to the Polish workers was much stronger than the Polish workers' commitment to the Bund. Others rejected armed insurgency on the grounds that there was no real evidence yet of a threat of deportations from Warsaw at that time, and that any armed resistance would provoke massive and brutal retaliation against the Jewish community and do more harm than good. Another argument was that they had few weapons apart from some homemade Molotov cocktails with which to fight the German army and its tanks, armored vehicles, and state-of-the-art weapons. And purchasing weapons meant using money that might otherwise be used for food or to save Jews hiding outside the ghetto, which was a more immediate concern. A few months later, on 23rd July 42, when the Great Deportation started, most of the political groups in the ghetto got together to try to decide what to do about the deportation. However, even in these terrible circumstances, the majority voted against the resistance because they bought the German lie that only 60,000 people would be deported, whereas any resistance would result in far worse consequences. The Zionist youth movements just couldn't accept this, and a few days later, they set up an underground resistance group called the Jewish Fighting Organization, known by its Polish initials of ZOB. But they just didn't get any real momentum, so there was no organized resistance to the Germans during the whole of the Great Deportation. By the time the Great Deportation ended, 21st September 42, over 80% of the ghetto's population had been deported and murdered. Those still alive realized that the Germans really did intend to wipe out all the remaining Jews in the ghetto, and they became more supportive of the resistance. And their support was fundamental because anything the underground movement did had to be done in secrecy because they were worried about informers. For example, Rabbi Menachem Zemba, one of the great rabbis of Poland and a leader of Agudas Yisrael, said, "Today, the only way to sanctify the name of God is to offer armed resistance." That was sufficient to stop any arguments in the Orthodox community. Following the change in the mood in the ghetto, most of the political groups agreed to put their long-standing and deep-rooted differences aside and join the ZOB in October 42. So the revitalized ZOB then became the mainstream self-defense organization for the ghetto under the unified military command of 23-year-old Mordechai Anilevich. I may have a picture of him. A cumbersome and complex political structure was cobbled together because each of the political groups in the ghetto wanted to call the shots. The groups that didn't join the ZOB were the Orthodox religious groups and the revisionists. So even when it became abundantly clear that the Germans were determined to kill every single Jew in the ghetto, the divide with the revisionists still could not be bridged. Consequently, the revisionists and their Beitar youth group formed their own separate underground movement known as the Jewish Military Union, or ZZW, by its Polish initials. Its commander was Pavel Frankel. The two fighting groups were very different. The ZOB regarded their members as being composed of the elite of Warsaw's Jewish youth imbued with the ideals of socialism, and they saw the ZZW as a gang of fascist thugs. The ZZW, on the other hand, saw themselves as serious fighters and far superior on military matters to the high-minded amateurs of the ZOB. ZZW was better equipped than the ZOB and managed to accumulate a large number of guns, ammunition, and grenades. Many of these weapons had been bought on the black market and then smuggled into the ghetto through 2 tunnels that the ZZW had built under the ghetto wall. Funds to purchase these weapons came from what was described as expropriations and contributions imposed by the ZZW on wealthy Jews in the ghetto. I suspect they were pretty good at persuading people to contribute. However, this further exacerbated the conflict with the ZOB, since they were also extracting money from the same wealthy Jews. Despite their differences, both fighting groups clearly understood that any revolt against the Germans would be suicidal, given the enormous disparity of the forces and arms involved. One of the first things that both groups did was to assassinate one by one those Jewish policemen and others who collaborated with the Nazis. These attacks were not just about revenge, but were also strategic. Whereas in some ghettos, the Jewish police supported, or at least turned a blind eye, to the activities of the Jewish underground, in the Warsaw ghetto, the Jewish police actually tried to eliminate the underground. Consequently, those in the underground felt that they had to stop their opponents from informing on them and from collaborating with the Germans. These attacks also made it easier to bribe the Jewish and Polish police who controlled entry into the ghetto, making it easier to smuggle in weapons and ammunition. So in the ghetto, you had Jews spying and informing on other Jews, Jews collaborating with the Germans, but refusing to collaborate with each other, Jews exploiting other Jews, Jews even killing other Jews. The Warsaw ghetto was a complete jungle. While my mother was hiding in the ghetto, she heard that the Jews in her hometown were being rounded up and murdered, and she was desperate for news about her sister Esther, who'd insisted on remaining in Novidvor. On 12th December 42, there was a gentle tapping at the door of the attic where my mother was hiding. It was her sister Esther. She'd managed to escape the rounding up of the Jews in Novidvor and was given food and shelter by a Christian Polish family. From there, she'd made the very risky journey to Warsaw and got into the ghetto. She was in a dreadful state, frightened, weary, and hungry. It was, as you can imagine, a very emotional meeting, particularly since my mother told Esther what had happened to their parents and their sister Toby, since Esther didn't know. My mother was very protective towards her younger sister, and they hid together in the ghetto for the next 5 months. A new round of deportation started on the morning of 18th January 43, when the Germans entered the ghetto to round up more Jews for transport to Treblinka. They planned to take only 8,000 people this time, but the ghetto population didn't know this, and they thought this was going to be the final destruction of the ghetto. So, to the Germans' great surprise, the Jewish fighters put up some armed resistance. A group of ZOB fighters, led by Mordechai Levich, intercepted a column of Jews who'd been rounded up by the Germans and were being taken to the Umschlagplatz. The Jewish fighters shot at the German soldiers and threw grenades at them, starting a tough battle. The news of the clash spread quickly to other cells in the underground, and they also began to resist and fire at the Germans. Now, most of the Jewish soldiers involved in this incident were killed, although Levich managed to overpower a German soldier who was chasing him and escaped unharmed. 12 Germans were killed that day. This was an incredibly important incident with far-reaching consequences, since this was the first time that the Jews in the ghetto had openly fought back against the Germans and killed some of them. So, despite the heavy losses, this was a morale booster for the Jewish fighters and an inspiration for the Jews in the ghetto, who believed, wrongly, that their fighters had stopped the final annihilation of the ghetto. The German leaders, particularly Himmler, were livid about what had happened and saw this as a humiliation, making them even more determined to wipe out the ghetto. The Jewish fighters understood this and spent the following weeks training, acquiring weapons, and making plans to defend the ghetto by rethinking their military tactics and learning lessons from what had been their first fight with the enemy. The German troops were rather shocked that the inferior and subhuman Jews had actually fought back, and they became less keen to enter the ghetto bunkers, where they were worried that they might meet with armed resistance. So overall, this was an indispensable step in preparing the fighters, as well as the Jews of the ghetto, for the larger uprising that they expected to come a little later. The ghetto population took the opportunity to extend and enhance their network of underground bunkers that had been equipped with electricity and stores of food and water so that they could hold out for an extended period. There were hundreds of these bunkers. They were built in cellars and sometimes dugouts underneath the cellars. It was rather like almost an underground city. A lot of them were interconnected. This was an unbelievable engineering feat, and it meant that every Jew in the ghetto had their own place to hide. So although Himmler was committed to destroying the ghetto, the big question was when. He decided to do it on 20th of April 1943 as a present for Hitler's 54th birthday. By now, the ghetto was much smaller, and the area that we're talking about is the area that should be shown in red on this little picture. On 18th April 43, reports were received that German troops were massing around the ghetto walls and preparing to finally deport all the remaining Jews to Treblinka or to the Majdanek concentration camps. The Jews in the ghetto went into hiding in their bunkers, and the fighters prepared for battle. There was still no coordination between the ZOB and the ZZW. Early the next morning, 19th April 43, Erev Pesach, the Germans entered the apparently deserted ghetto. This was the beginning of the end of the ghetto. The Jewish fighters were massively outnumbered and outgunned. It's very difficult to get accurate numbers, but there were probably no more than 1,000 Jewish fighters in total, maybe 750 for the ZOB and 250 for the ZZW, with light arms, 1 or 2 machine guns, grenades, and Molotov cocktails, up against 2,000 heavily armed and well-trained German SS troops, supported by tanks, armored weapons, armored vehicles, and flamethrowers. But the Jews were prepared and launched what became known as the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising with a surprise attack when the German troops reached an intersection and were surrounded on all 4 sides. The Germans were totally unprepared for the attack, and the Jews managed to set 2 tanks on fire. One of the crews was burned alive, and German soldiers ran away screaming, their clothes on fire, spreading panic through the ranks. Later that afternoon, Pavel Frankel, the ZZW commander, and his deputy managed to get on the roof of one of the high tenement houses and unfurled a Zionist and a Polish flag. The Zionist is the Star of David. These flags were clearly visible outside the ghetto and became a symbol of the uprising. They were a major morale boost to the Jews and a serious irritation for the Germans, who tried very hard to take them down. That night was the first Seder night of Pesach, and all across the ghetto, Jews in their hiding places celebrated Pesach as best they could. After the war, my mother always found Pesach a very difficult time. Although buoyed up by their success on the first day of the uprising, the Jewish fighters knew that theirs ultimately was a lost cause, but they were committed to dying with honor whilst fighting the Germans, not in the gas chamber. Fierce fighting continued, and the Jewish fighters fought with such great bravery and courage that on the 3rd day of the uprising, the German commander, SS General Jürgen Stroop, ordered the ghetto to be burned to the ground, building by building, forcing the Jews remaining inside to either come out of hiding and be shot or arrested, or be burned alive inside their hiding places. On 8th of May 43, the Germans captured the headquarters bunker of the ZOB at Mila 18. Mordechai Anilevich and dozens of his colleagues died in that bunker. Their bodies were never recovered, and the general understanding is that they died from either gas poisoning or committed suicide. 2 days later, on 10th May 43, about 10 German soldiers entered the building where my mother and her sister Esther were hiding. My mother was cooking some food in the bunker of the building at the bottom, having left Esther in the attic at the top, which was considered safer. The Germans came in quietly. Their boots were wrapped in straw to deaden the sound, and they forced my mother and all the other people into the bunker onto the streets. In all the commotion, my mother didn't see what happened to Esther, but she never saw her again. More Jews who'd been captured in other buildings joined them, and many others who tried to escape were shot in the streets. Then my mother was marched to the Umschlagplatz, rather like in the photo behind me. She stayed there all night, and on the next day she was forced into a railway freight car. Luckily for her, her train didn't go to Treblinka, which would have meant certain death. Instead, she went to Majdanek, where only some of the Jews were murdered on arrival. I've been to Majdanek, and seen the book in which the Germans recorded all the trains that arrived there, an ordinary ledger book. There was a separate column for each train, and my mother's train was the last one to come from Warsaw. The Jewish resistance against the Germans and the burning of the ghetto by the Germans continued for a few more days until 16th May 43. The Jewish resistance against the Germans and the burning of the ghetto by the Germans continued for a few more days until 16th of May 43. Then, after 27 days of fighting, it was all over. Not one building was left standing in the ghetto. 13,000 Jews had been killed, and almost all the remaining 50,000 had been sent to Majdanek or Treblinka. 16 Germans had been killed and 85 wounded. And on that day, as a symbol of victory, General Stroop personally pressed the button to blow up the Great Synagogue in Tomlaki Street, one of the grandest buildings in Poland. Then with great pride, he announced that the Jewish quarter of Warsaw no longer exists. He was awarded the Iron Cross First Class for leading the German troops in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. So what can we take away from all of this? Well,
I think we have a technical problem.
okay. Yeah, can you hear us? Is that okay?
I'm going to try and relog on.
Okay, so what can we take away from all this? Well, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was obviously an inspiring event showing how a group of Jewish youngsters, against all the odds, chose to stand up to a brutal bully and die honorably. In the early years of the state, many Israelis saw this rebellion as exemplifying the new Jew, brave and fierce. And although Holocaust Memorial Day around the world is generally commemorated on the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, in Israel it's based on the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. So was the uprising a success, or was it just a futile gesture? Well, it obviously wasn't a military victory, but I don't think that anyone expected it to be. I think that its main purpose was to demonstrate that though the Jews could be crushed physically, their spirit remained intact despite everything that the Nazis threw at them. Against that objective, and from a symbolic point of view, this display of resistance was an enormous success, and it certainly inspired other resistance movements and uprisings across German-occupied Poland. But we also need to look at the way that one group of people, the Nazis and their supporters, were able to deliberately and totally dehumanize their victims, both physically and psychologically. I have to say that despite all my efforts, I still don't really understand how one group of people could have done that to another group of people. And whilst we may be appalled at the depths to which some people sank to save themselves, should we really be surprised? And in any case, how should we judge them when, however hard we try to imagine it, we'll never know how we would have behaved if, heaven forbid, we were to find ourselves in their position. Okay, Lawrence, that's it.
Thank you very much, Hyman. That was incredible, so comprehensive. I'm not sure I've got any questions on the facts. I suppose questions are really on opinion. I think we had a chat a little while ago regarding the photograph that you put behind you, and the fact that it's a Nazi photograph, and you mentioned how the Nazis needed to depict the Jews as subhuman, and it made it easy for the population to accept what was being done. But how do you think the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising actually ended that, or perhaps changed the opinion of the population, of the German population, as to how the Jews would react?
Yeah.
Who knows? What I do know is that the Germans tried to depict this as not just a Jewish event. So the Jews in the ghetto were often referred to as communists, and sometimes they were alleged to have had a lot of support from the Poles. So clearly it was a major one in the eye for the Germans that the Jews had actually done that, and tried to play that down as much as they could. So I'm sure that would have been the German version. The German version was really about their victory over these bandits, as they were called by General Stroop in his official report. They did their job and wiped these people out.
Thank you. I'm going to open this for questions. There's 5 screens, so I'm just going to look through the screens, and if anyone can raise their hand. Andrew Kaufman, I see your hand. Can you unmute yourself?
I'm unmuted. Yeah.
Okay.
Laura, Hyman, that was absolutely tremendous how you prepared that talk. I want to know
Incredibly interesting.
what happened to your mother after her release at Majdanek.
Oh, thank you. Well, that's a long story. But she went to Majdanek. She was there for a period. She went to another labor camp, a place called Skarżysko Kamienna, which was an ammunition factory, German ammunition factory, a company called Hasag. There were different sections. She worked in what they call Work C. They made ammunition, and in that section, they used pitric acid to make this stuff. People didn't last very long there. They died from the acid fumes, and they turned yellow. It was just awful. That was probably worse than being in a concentration camp. Then she was moved, same company, to Leipzig, doing something similar. Then death march. So she went through the whole gamut. And that's another long, detailed, and very tough story.
Thank you so much. It was quite incredible. Thank you.
I mean, when did your mother start talking about her story to you?
She spoke sort of fairly early on. She was okay to talk about it. Unlike my father, who didn't. They didn't talk. Apart from anything else, there was embarrassment of what had happened to them. There was being on a completely different wavelength. How do you chat with someone over tea and say, oh, by the way, I was in a concentration camp, with someone who's got no comprehension at all of what it was like? I think it took a long time before people got a sort of understanding of what it might have been like, before survivors felt that they could possibly relate to other people. It was terribly difficult.
Any other questions?
Yes. Hi.
Stephen, can you unmute yourself? And then Eleanor Levy. Stephen?
Yeah. Thank you, Jaime. That was incredible. Just one simple question. Can you tell us a little bit more about your mother's diary, which you just mentioned and didn't say much about it? It must have been very useful. And what happened to it? Is there anything published?
Yeah, she wrote down a record of what had happened to her. She remembered the date. She wrote it shortly after the war, for me and for her family, basically. She also wrote about her story for the Yiska book. So a lot of the old communities had a Yiska book where the survivors together wrote articles about what life was like. So she had an article in there. So I've got quite a bit of hard information that she kept. But it was really, she wrote it for her grandchildren.
Thank you.
Eleanor? Can't hear you. You need to unmute yourself.
Okay, is that all right?
Yes.
Hi, thank you very, very much for that. I've also, my family were in the lodge or the Wood Ghetto, so I wanted to ask how many people actually did survive? Did your mother make contact with them? And also, did your mother help Leon Uris with his book, Milo 18? Was she involved at all in that?
No, she wasn't involved with Leon Uris. Precise numbers, it's difficult, probably tens or dozens of survivors. So I've met some of them. There's a small street in Cholon named after her hometown, where obviously some of the survivors went. So a number of them ended up in Israel. So not that many. Some of the survivors or their families in America actually got together and did a lot of work at the cemetery in her hometown, which has been destroyed, and all the tombstones, as the usual story, taken away, used as paving stones. And they made a lovely memorial in that cemetery, a very, very smart and interesting one. And they've had a number of events there. Some events with the chief rabbi of Poland, there was one, and the American ambassador. And what they've set up, which is very nice, They've got a lot of support from the local Polish community there now, and they created a prize. And every year there's a competition for the kids, the local kids, to write a story, an essay on tolerance or humanity or something like that, which they take very seriously, and they award a prize. So there's a nice little event there. I went to one of those events. I was staying at the hotel, had to take a taxi to the cemetery for the event. The taxi driver refused to take any fare. So that was very nice.
Thank you very, very much. That was incredibly moving and so illuminative, if that's the right word, but I'm sure you know what I mean.
Neville, I saw you raise your hand. Neville Schulman.
Yes, Hyman, that was so moving, so riveting, so that I'm still sort of, in a way, gasping for air after listening to it, because it's such an emotional, personal story, and you know, one's heart goes out to you as such. So, I mean, in a way, I feel that you somehow live with the story continually. Obviously, it means a lot to you, and it's part of your ongoing life. So, is it something that, in a way, you can't put aside because it's part of your personal story? Is that right?
It's part of me, but and it's there, and it's there. I'm not haunted by it in that sense. I remember I once had the privilege of being a session where Elie Wiesel spoke, and he made what I thought was a wonderful comment. He said, "You must remember the past, but not live in the past." I think that's the right way.
Well, it's great. I mean, you know, all my heart goes out to you, because I think you've done something really magnificent here. So I'm very pleased to have heard it and be part of it, and good luck for all that you do. Thank you indeed.
Thank you, Neville. Anyone else have a question? Mendel. Hi, Mendel.
It's Rachel Levy. I have a statement.
I mean, that was terrific.
Amos Oz summed it up beautifully, I think, when he said, "We live in a crippled world. We live really in a moral quagmire." And it is very moving to hear you reading the story that you are reading. Thank you.
I just want to tell a story, and everybody, Jaime and everybody, a story about Chava, Jaime's mother. I'm sure I've told you, Jaime, but it was about the time when the Queen Mother was about to be 100 years old. And I went in to see Chava. And I said to her, "How are you?" She said to me, "You know, Mendel," she says, "I don't know why, but I remembered what I said to myself every day in concentration camp. And every day in concentration camp, I said to myself, I'm young, I'm healthy, I'm strong, and I will survive." And you know, Mendel," she said, "I looked at the Queen Mother and I thought to myself, you know what? I could be 100 as well." Well, she never quite made it, but that was a clue to her inner strength that allowed her to survive. And Jaime should be very proud of you today.
Thank you. Sorry, can I share one little story about my mother?
Yes, of course.
So this was in the era when Tony Blair was Prime Minister. So what, 10, 15 years ago, whatever. There was a big Holocaust event. And my mother was invited, and there was a reception which involved Holocaust survivors and the Queen and Prince Philip. And Prince Philip came up to my mother. So she's in her 80s. And he said to her, starts to engage her, asked, "How old are you?" And she said, "I'm 25," and turned around and walked away.
Wonderful. Thank you, Hyman. Carol, you've got a question? I saw you raise your hand.
Yeah, Jaime, we've known you through your mother, but I'm fascinated. This is this wonderful story to listen to what we're going through. But I want to know where Mr.
I think you put your hand up here.
Could you repeat that?
Sorry, I said I'd like to know when Mr. Wolanski came into the picture and what was his story.
I think it's you. Tell him it's you.
So thank you, Carl. Well, he has a story too. He came into the picture after the war. My mother, most of the survivors, the first thing that they did was go back to their hometown to see if there was any news of any survivors from their family and friends. So that's what my mother did. There were no survivors. But while she was there, she met my father. He had a different background. He'd lost all his family. They were all shot in front of him. He went into the partisans and ended up in the Russian army. Was involved in the liberation of Berlin. So he had a very different story.
I didn't hear
Could you all mute yourselves, please? Could you all mute yourselves, because we're getting a lot of feedback. Everybody, just check you're muted.
So shall I repeat that? So she went back to, my mother went back to her hometown after the war, which most of the survivors did, to see what was left of their family. And she met my father after the war. He was from a place called Baranovic, which is now Belarus. And all of his family was shot in front of him. He survived because he was an electrician. He went into the partisans and then joined the Russian army and was involved in the liberation of Berlin. So he's got another story. But I know much less about his story because, unlike my mother, he didn't talk about it.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Yes. Yes. Jaime, you mentioned at the beginning of your talk about the two resistances, the Polish resistance, where there's a museum. I happened to be in Warsaw about 4 or 5 years ago, just before the Jewish Museum opened, and was trying to find some record of what had happened there. Of course, there was no Jewish record at all at that time. And I went to that Museum of Resistance, and there, disappointingly, there was hardly any reference whatsoever to the Warsaw Ghetto or the Jewish resistance at all. Had you any thoughts on that one, or had you any knowledge about that?
I don't know that particular museum. There's the Jewish Historical Institute, as well as now there's the Jewish Historical Institute and the Polin Museum. The Jewish Historical Institute is fantastic. It's a small place. They look after the Ringelblum archives, and it's really, they've got one of the milk churns there. It's really fantastic. Then of course there's the Polin Museum itself, which is now in Warsaw, in the area of what was the ghetto, which is a stupendous museum of the history of the Jews in Poland, going back nearly 1,000 years. For a lot of the time, you didn't have the anti-Semitism that we associate with Poland. It was a different story. But I don't know that particular museum you're talking about, David.
Thank you very much. Thank you, David. Okay, it's almost 12:15. I'm exhausted from listening to you, Jaime. I don't know how you feel. You must be shattered. It's a real privilege to have heard that from you. Sure, everybody feels the same. And just thank you for everyone for joining us. And yes.
Lawrence, we were up to 111 participants. That's a record, I think.
That's terrible. Jaime's asked me for money for each person.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Hyman.